We are really honoured today to have Derek Wall with us from the Green Party, an author and activist, and a former, what do you call a spokesperson? Principal speaker for the Green Party. I'm going to let him actually dive straight in as we're starting a bit late, and I hope that you'll enjoy it and participate later in some questions and answers.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the invite. I tend to quite enjoy writing. Once I've written books, I kind of forget about them a bit, really, and I don't do as much of this as I should, really. And also, I tend to upset my publishers quite a bit. So I'm going to talk about various things in writing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this Rise the Green Left book from Pluto. And when I had the book launch for it, they said, you're not going to do what you did for the last book launch. And I knew what was coming. So the last book launch, you said to people not to buy the book, but go and get it from the library. And, you know, I'm kind of lucky because I teach and I get paid for teaching, and that kind of keeps me in bread and soup and mortgages and child maintenance. So I don't kind of write for a living. And I kind of think, in some ways, it's rather strange writing books about commons and ecology and trying to do the hard sell. So, to me, a big kind of solution to things like climate change is libraries. And I think it's, you know, kind of quite bitter to be here, and that we've got this splendid resource, and it's being acknowledged by the local authority. And, you know, that in a sense is more important, you know, that I'll talk about all sorts of solutions to climate change and so on, but, you know, defending your library, you know, and I don't know whether I'm allowed to incite people to occupy public buildings, but I, you know, hope people do and defend it, because, you know, we're not going to save the world by authors selling people lots of books. Part of saving the world is going to be about libraries, and I'll get on to that. Okay, so I've written kind of various books. I wrote my two recent books. I'm very self-conscious plugging my books, really. I don't really like kind of plugging books. You know, this is kind of information, really, and information should be free. It shouldn't be something sold. You know, it's a little bit. You know, if we started inventing recipes now, we didn't have the idea of recipes. Every time you made soup, you'd have to pay somebody copyright. You know, and books are just information like recipes. But I wrote the Rise of the Green Left on kind of green left eco-socialist politics, and I'll maybe read a little bit from the real climate change swindle and about a lot of the problems with the supposed solutions to climate change and why they don't work. Also got the No-Nonsense Guide to Green Politics, which is from New Internationalists, and I probably should plug this even more because I do think New Internationalists do a really good job. So if you are going to buy books, buy, you know, some of their stuff, and it kind of funds them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these books. Also, I'm writing a book on commons, and people tend to go, oh, is that like, you know, the countryside and the village green, or people who maybe come from another way go, oh, that's like the World Wide Web. So I'll probably try and talk mainly about the new book that I'm writing, which is Culture, Conflict and Ecology, the Commons in History, which is looking at the kind of environmental history of commons. Okay, I'll maybe briefly talk sometimes about reading from my books, because I never really kind of read stuff out, really, because it's very non-spontaneous. I think what I was going to kind of start with, which actually comes from, confusing the three books as well, is from this book, are two kind of key quotes. One of the quotes is from Ellen Rostrom, who was the first woman to win the Nobel Prize for Economics. And she won a politics prize, you know, 4 or 5 years back. And when she won it in America, she said, I want to thank the indigenous people of North America because they've got a 7-generation rule. And she said, we need to reinstate this rule. And whenever we have economic policies or other policies, we should think of the next 7 generations. And I think that's a really key quote, because at the moment in our society, we find it difficult to think about the next 7 months or 7 weeks, and with privatisation and marketising the economy more, the economy is more and more dependent on bond markets, and they barely think 7 minutes. So, really fundamental insight, I think, from Eleanor, that we've got to think about the next 7 generations. And the other quote I like, which is a contrast, because Eleanor, bless her, comes very much from kind of Hayekian, originally quite free market roots, is from that guy with the beard, Karl Marx. And Marx said that the idea of people owning the land, people owning the earth, one day will be as absurd as people owning other people as the form of slaves. And he wrote this in Das Kapital, Volume 3. I'm sad enough to have read all 3 volumes. And he said that nobody, even a whole nation, society, isn't truly the owners of the earth. And what we have to do is act as good heads of household and leave the earth in a better condition for future generations. So I think, to me, the sort of Marx quote and the Eleanor quote are kind of key, because it's the idea of collective responsibility and thinking of future generations rather than short-term greed. And if we look at climate change, the devastation of our planet, huge problems created by climate change, are hardly on the political agenda, that it's seen as something which is almost trivial and forgotten. And what we have is what I would describe as the kind of suicide lobby, that you have the climate skeptics or denialists who are, remind me, and in fact have a direct lineage, some of them, back to the situation with tobacco firms in the 50s and 60s. And the tobacco firms knew that their product was killing, its consumers, and was killing millions, potentially billions of people. And did they say, oh my goodness, this is a huge ethical problem? No, what they did was they thought, how can we actually spend millions of dollars finding scientists who we can funnel money to, spending money working with journalists to actually muddy the water so that we can keep on selling and we can keep on killing more people. And of course, when you think back to cigarettes, there are very sophisticated arguments that cancer, of course, is something which does have multiple causes. It is very difficult to trace, exactly the cause of cancer. Maybe people don't like to be told what to do by government, and there's all sorts of, important arguments, maybe. But at the end of the day, they were spending millions to kill millions. And we're in the same situation with climate skeptics and climate denialists at the moment, that there is a huge lobby from fossil fuel companies that know their product is very destructive, know that what they're doing is unsustainable, but they want to keep on making the money, and that's more important than dealing with the planet. And okay, when you bring in policies, there's contradictions, and science is complex, but essentially there's a huge self-interest, what I would call the kind of suicide lobby, funding climate denial. But even when we look at efforts to deal with climate change, they're flawed, they're very problematic at the moment. So my second chapter in the Green Left book is called The Real Climate Change Swindle. And what I think is rather sobering is we have had these international conferences around the world, we've had a process that's gone on for decades, there's lots of kind of talk of dealing with climate change, there's some increase in renewable energy, yet emissions are still rising. So whether you look at CO2 or you look at most of the other greenhouse gases possible, not the CFCs, but most of the others like methane, they've been steadily rising. So, there's a great debate about whether the temperature rise will be kept at 2 centigrade or 3 centigrade and the disaster and, the how many parts per million. But what's sobering is there's no evidence that we're reducing production of CO2 and other climate change gases, that it continues to rise steadily. And I think the reason for this is, in a sense, that we have a kind of economy and a society which is carbon addicted, and is certainly addicted to economic growth, economic accumulation, producing more and more. And, you know, libraries are a threat to that, aren't they? So, you know, as an author, I should be trying to write more books. Well, I do write more books just because I'm just like staying on writing books, really. It's my probably personality defect. But, you know, I should be going out there and sell, and make money from books, but I'd rather people borrowed them, you know. And, you know, you do have this kind of thing in a capitalist economy, that if you have forms of social sharing and libraries, and you make things to last longer, the economy doesn't work so well. So there is this drive to kind of produce and consume and waste. And climate change has got to kind of fit in with that. That, you know, we have an economic system, and biology's got to fit in with that. You know, it's an economic system, so it's a social system, and you get different economic and social systems, and you can do things in different ways. But, you know, it has such a powerful kind of gravitational pull that whatever we do has to fit in with it. So even if you look at climate change, on the whole, climate change policy has been sustainable in the sense that it's people trying to sustain the economy rather than trying to sustain the ecology. So if you look at the framework for dealing with this and all the negotiations, and, you know, I'm certainly not criticising the Alba countries like Cuba and Venezuela and Bolivia, who've really fought for real climate reductions, but the international agreements we've got, the mechanism is the market mechanism. It's through carbon trading. So the idea is you limit how much CO2 can be produced, you divide it into lots, you allow people to produce a certain amount of CO2. If they want to produce more, they have to pay for it. And you think, well, you know, what could possibly go wrong with this? This seems entirely sensible. Yet if you look at this, there's no real kind of policing of it. There's all sorts of get-out clauses. And essentially what it's done is created more activity for bankers. In a sense, what we've done with carbon trading is said, they've done such a brilliant job wrecking the economy, let's put bankers in charge of climate policy. So you even have hedge funds for carbon. And, you know, as I say, it's not properly policed, there's lots of get-out clauses. So, you know, you may know about clean development mechanism. So companies in Europe can you produce more CO2 if they pay for supposedly cleaner development around the rest of the world. Now, to me, this is a little bit like saying to people, smoking's very bad for the environment, very bad for human beings, but we acknowledge that you don't want to give up smoking. So what we're going to do is sort of have some sort of nicotine scheme where you keep smoking, but you pay for other people to give up smoking in China, or you pay for some advertising about the damage that nicotine does for people in India, yeah? And it gets even worse. I mean, again, on paper, like a lot of things, like the banking system, it looks like common sense, that the idea is that you pay for companies like Steelworks in India to produce energy more cleanly, and then that reduces CO2. But one of the examples I talk about in the Green Left book is you have Steelworks in Orissa, and the Steelworks peasants have been removed from the land, peasants protesting against this have been shot, and the Steelworks is funded via a clean development mechanism. And it's only getting that money because it's bringing in, you know, ways of generating the energy for steel that they were probably going to bring in anyway, but is paid for by the clean development mechanism. You've also got REDs, and the idea again on the face of it looks sensible, that one of the most important ways of dealing with climate change is through preserving the world's rainforests. A better way of doing this is to send money to the indigenous people, and then they can get lawyers and stop their land being stolen, of course. But with REDs, what you're effectively doing is fencing off the world's forests.
Can you explain what REDs is?
So REDs is, I have to find it here, but it's basically the idea that you, again, can produce more CO2 in Europe if you pay for these schemes. And it's basically to do with forests. So what you do is you pay for a forest, in theory, to be preserved, but in practice, quite often what you're doing is enclosing forests, kicking off the indigenous people involved with them. Sometimes these forests can be turned into plantations. So the REDs may actually make things worse. And certainly there are big implications for actually taking people off of the land who are in these forests. What we've also seen is biofuels. So in the European Union, the idea is something like, I think, 5% of vehicle fuel has got to be biodiesel. Again, this sounds absolutely fine, that what you do is you grow plants. You know about this, you grow plants, and what could possibly go wrong? Plants are kind of green, and then you turn them into fuel, and then you can drive your cars. And of course, there's all sorts of negative implications, that rather than growing food, you effectively grow petrol. So one of the reasons why commodity prices of food have gone up over the last few years is because there's more demand for land, for crops, for biofuels. A major source of European Union biofuels is palm oil. Major source of palm oil is Colombia. And what we've seen in Colombia is right-wing death squads, the AUC, actually taking people's land, threatening them, cutting people's limbs off sometimes, to get people off of land so the land can be used to grow palm oil. And I could kind of go on. So what we've kind of unfortunately got with a lot of the solutions to climate change on the whole is policies that fit in with the great car economy and economic growth, banks and economic expansion, rather than directly saying, how can we reduce CO2? So if you look at this whole global framework, it's not actually saying, how do we bring in more wind generation and so on. It's very much about market mechanisms that at best are kind of indirect. And again, you've got what was identified by the American author John Bellamy Foster as the kind of Jevons effect, or he got it from the economist Jevons. And what happens is you bring in, say, more fuel-efficient cars, or you bring in more renewable energy. I'm obviously not against things which are more fuel efficient. I'm somewhat ambivalent about cars, partly because they're not environmentally good, and I'm not competent enough to drive myself. But I'm not against efficiency, and I'm certainly not against more wind and wave and solar. However, what you tend to have is the economy grows, and you need more energy, so you get more energy from renewables, but you're still generating more CO2, because you've had the growth in renewables, but the other energy sources you're continuing to use just as much. So, it's interesting that we don't actually, with climate change policy, say, let's, Cynthia McKinney in the States said, let's keep the oil in the soil, which is sort of geologically, I suppose, wrong, but is quite poetic. So we're not actually saying to countries, let's find ways of funding you to keep fossil fuels in the ground. You've got this kind of insane economy, and all the time in the media, even in the Guardian, I'm a fan of the Guardian, will say there's a new oil field open, isn't this brilliant, more oil in the North Sea, etc., etc. Yet, we know this is unsustainable, and we're going to destroy biological systems on the Earth. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the risks of runaway climate change, and again, the science is very complex, but there's certainly a risk that temperatures rise, and that creates feedback mechanisms that make things worse. Okay, there's things that damp it down, but there's certainly a big risk that as temperatures rise, the permafrost in places like Siberia and northern Canada defrost, and then that releases methane, and that's a worse greenhouse gas. Even without talking about the risks of runaway climate change, something that is very worrying is the fact that we've got ocean acidification, and this is something that I read not in Green Party publication, but I read in The Economist magazine. I teach economics, so I read The Economist, and what they're saying, and scientists are saying, is within 30, 40 years, the oceans are going to go from being slightly alkaline to slightly acidic. And then if you think of plankton, other calcium carbonate creatures, that's a threat to them. So the fact that we're even talking about risks, extraordinary risks like this, is terrifying, is flabbergasting. Even if it's a sort of downside risk, it's such major things. Yet what we've got is this kind of economy where it's more consumption, more production, more growth, more waste, that generates more and more CO2. So certainly in both books, I look at real solutions to climate change, and that of course will get me onto the stuff on the commons, although if I talk for too long you can tell me to shut up. So what I certainly look at, both these books, maybe particularly the No Nonsense Guide, is that what we need to be doing is actually protecting the world's rainforests, because rainforests, as I say, are a carbon sink. In many of the forests there's gas and oil and coal that we need to keep in the ground. So to me, what's been the kind of great good news story is the fact that in, say, Peru, you've got the indigenous people in the Amazon, organised into A to Z, with 50 different Amazonian groups, and they've actually used non-violent direct action to stop the Amazon being sold off for gas and oil exploration. So that's important, that matters, that's a good news story. Indigenous people over the past, I'm not romanticising them, William Cronin in his great book Changes in the Land about New England talked about degradation of the environment when Europeans went to North America, but he does also point out that the indigenous in New England liked having huge fires, and that's not environmentally brilliant. Indigenous people, say, around the world have killed various species and so on, but indigenous people quite often have learnt from their mistakes and found better ways of managing their resources so they work ecologically. So I think that, is very, very important. I certainly do think that we need things like Green New Deal, million climate jobs and roll out renewables. But most fundamentally, I would say, we need a different economic model. So Tim Jackson's book is called Prosperity Without Growth, that some of you may have heard about. And what I'm really interested in, to the extent that I'm all teaching economics, is ways of actually increasing our prosperity, our development, with less material growth, which, as I said earlier, if you can download books, if you've got libraries for books, like I said earlier, if you can make things that will actually last longer, if you can have all sorts of forms of social sharing, collaborative consumption, there are ways of actually having more access to more things with less material throughput. So we do have this rather insane economy that kind of artificially creates scarcity. It's one in fact that if you look at laptops continually advance, but it's certainly rumoured that particular companies that make the computers will have 4 or 5 generations of computers. Mobile phones, I bet BlackBerry, there's like another 4 or 5 stages of technology. So we'll kind of buy each stage, chuck it away, buy another one, and that creates profit and growth and jobs and so on. But it's a form of madness. So what I'm kind of interested in is all the ways that we effectively deal with climate change and other environmental ills and manage resources effectively and use less energy and have renewables and defend indigenous people. But fundamentally I'm interested in how we have an economic system which isn't organised madness, where we're not constantly throwing things away, where we actually measure progress in terms of our access to goods and services and things that we need. So kind of that might take me on to the comments. Shall I go on to my other book? Yeah. And then I'll eventually shut down.
How long have we got?
Well, we have to be out of here for 9 o'clock.
Right.